So the first thing I wanted to do was make sure that I covered a couple things that are things that I believe about writing, really for anything, but specifically for percussion, because like Matt may have said at some earlier point in time, writing for percussion is hard, especially if it's not something you engage with as a performer to kind of know what it's like on the receiving end. The big thing that I always remind aspiring composers and composers who have been at it for a long time, and myself every time I sit down and write, is that music is a language. And we hear that said a lot. And when I was younger, I used to think like, yeah, okay, like metaphorically, sure, that's cute, like it works. Music is literally a language, right? It's sound conveying meaning. And it really follows all of the rules of any other language, including how we learn it and how we become fluent in it. Speaking, writing, reading, all those things really hold true. So the biggest suggestion that I have for folks when they're saying like, how can I write in a style or how can I write for an instrument, is do the same thing you do when you're learning language. Step one is listen to the language. So if you want to write for percussion, just listen to a bunch of stuff that has percussion. Get to know what it can sound like. Get to know what different instruments do. You know, what does a vibraphone sound like? What kind of music would you hear it in? What can a drum set do? Like, what are the different groups? And then from there, once you've got the sound in your head, when you start to try to figure out how to write it, it makes a lot more sense. Sometimes folks try to start from the writing part before they have done the listening part, and that is really, really tricky. The way I always talk about it with my students at the high school is imagine like trying to teach a baby a brand new language and having the first thing you do with the baby be, okay, baby, write. Baby, here's a pencil, write English. No, we'll listen to it later, right? It's insane. It's ludicrous. But we tend to do it in music a lot. we just say like, okay, go. And then later on, we fill in the blanks. So, you know, more than listening to me blab for the next 45 minutes or whatever, if you really want to do yourself the biggest favor, you just pause this video, go out, listen to some great percussion writing and great percussion playing, and then start asking questions like, how would you notate that? How would you write that? Now that you've paused the video and come back after listening to hours and hours of great percussion music, we can get into some stuff about notation. The other big rule that I always encourage people to do is just go for it. Just do it. Like, if you're not sure, like, well, I'm not exactly sure how to notate this, but like, it would be cool. Don't let that stop you from giving it a shot, because chances are you'll get pretty close with some common sense. And then with a couple tweaks, you can make it correct. But especially with percussion, a lot of this stuff is still kind of developing. Like, a standardized code for percussion notation isn't something that really exists. Oftentimes you will see at the beginning of a piece, if the percussion writing is complicated, an actual legend, like an actual template that shows, hey, for this piece, this is how I plan on writing the percussion. So, you know, a lot of times as composers, we can hold ourselves back by being like, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm incorrect in how I write? And my advice is just do it. you'll figure it out along the way. Okay, that said, there are some good resources and things that you can check out when writing. And I put together a few things for everybody. So I'm assuming on the recorded video of this, we'll put this link somewhere in the description or in a comment section or something. But folks who are here live right now, I'm going to drop this little googly doc into the chat. And you can pull that up. Give me a shout if you have any trouble accessing that. And we'll take just a quick scrolly tour and then kind of dig into some of the stuff. So up at the top of the doc, I linked in just a few videos that I thought were cool that showed some different examples of what percussion can do. And this is by no means an extensive list or a comprehensive list. It's just, you know, some stuff that came to mind when I was asked by Matt, what are some of the sounds? What are some of the ideas? What are some of the, you know, the cool things that percussion can accomplish? So we'll do a little bit of listening in a minute to some of this stuff and talk about it. Below that is a sample auxiliary percussion legend. So this is an example of what I was talking about, where like you literally explain, you teach your player how to read your notated music. So here we have a situation that has a bunch of different instruments, and they're laid out with the labels of the instruments shown, so you can see what's going on. Below that is a link to a document I put together, oh boy, a number of years ago, that's specifically drum set stuff. Drum set, I would say, is probably the most unique percussion instrument to write for. There are some notation rules that really only apply to drum set and are things that you just kind of have to know. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And just at the bottom is kind of what I was saying a minute ago. It, like, when in doubt, just write it out. Just use some good old common, write it in English, just explain with some words what you want to have happen. And your percussionist can probably make it go for you. All right, let's do some listening. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and use some of my precious time to not say anything and just let us listen. So I think if I'm recalling from my remote teaching days, shudder, what will work best here is we will go on mute and we'll listen for a minute or two to each of these, and then we'll come back and we can talk about them. So we'll just run down the list. So the first one we're going to check out is a little bit of a marimba concerto. So we'll go on mute. We'll watch a little bit of that concerto, listen to it, and then I'll bring us back in a minute. Okay, here we go.
Marimba vibes.
Oh yeah, that's nice.
We're gonna bring her into Vermont in 2 years. Just so yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So cool. All right, what we got queued up next here?
Wildlands.
Some battery percussion duo. Okay, yeah, this is cool. Let's check it out. Nice. Yeah, cool. That's a cool example of some of the, the quote unquote unpitched percussion, like the toms and stuff, starting to take on some melodic characteristics there. Pretty cool. All right.
Really nice to see, like, for the choreography and coordination that comes into all of this too. It's super cool. Speak of the devil. mesmerizing.
Yeah, isn't that cool sound?
That's
Um, that I picked that one not only because it just is like an awesome piece. It's so simple and really pretty. But it's emblematic of rethinking percussion instruments. Technically, this is not a percussion instrument right now, right? It's actually a bowed instrument.
right.
But we can use the tools that we have back in the percussion section in some really interesting ways to get some cool, some cool different options for tones and textures going on. Which I think the next one, if I'm remembering my order right, oh yeah, this is the piece de resistance. I'm going to suggest we watch the whole thing on this one. This is a crazy one.
Absolutely amazing. I had no idea that one could produce sounds like this on bass drum.
It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger on the stage. It's this fire-breathing dragon. It's an electrifying piece.
It may be the world's first concerto for solo bass drum. The composer is Gabriel Prokofiev, grandson of Sergei Prokofiev and a friend of Princeton music professor Simon Morrison.
Completely unlike his grandfather. He does these wonderful club nights in which they mix and match different modern pieces of music. He's got a label that does that.
Gabriel Prokofiev's musical background is eclectic.
When I was 10 years old, I formed a band with a friend doing pop songs.
His concerto for bass drum was influenced by British percussionist Joby Burgess.
He definitely showed me some new sounds I'd never come across.
Burgess is soloist for this world premiere at Princeton University.
We've got thimbles, which we use on the metal of the drum. There are super balls, which create friction on the drum shell and on the skins. The chains kind of add a sparkly sizzle.
He even uses sticks of Hawaiian bamboo.
This thing explodes as you play, and after 3 or 4 performances, you have to make a new one because there's nothing left.
Like Gabriel Prokofiev, the percussionist's career involves working across genres.
I work as an improviser, I work with Indian musicians, jazz musicians, rock and roll musicians, playing in bizarre venues around the world.
But this collaboration with the Princeton Symphony Orchestra is unique.
The world premiere performance of Gabriel's concerto for bass drum, that's the first anywhere in the world, a concerto for bass drum.
Both Prokofiev and Burgess are musical innovators.
He's one of these percussionists that can really do anything you ask him to.
Cool.
They're interacting with new and diverse audiences.
You've got to give these pieces a life. You've got to work out how they sound, how the audience reacts. You know, you bouncing off them as well.
And their outlook on live music in the 21st century?
People tighten their belts. People still go to concerts though. I'm not sure anything's really going to stop us.
Bringing a new bass drum concerto to life in Richardson Auditorium at Princeton University. Susan Haig, New Jersey Arts News.
That's super cool.
Isn't that rad?
That's so rad.
So this is one where, like, man, yeah, the boundaries are being pushed on like what an instrument can do. I think always of sort of the classic like middle school band room where the fight is who gets the snare drum part, and then somebody is relegated to the lowly bass drum. And man, here it is, like doing it all. The bass drum killing the game, right? So it's cool to see how far percussion instruments can go in terms of their range of expression. The other thing that this one really made me think of is the notation issue. So like there is no correct way to notate rubber ball mounted on stick, creating sound on cello bass drum, right? Like that's not going to be in your textbook on page 37, and then somebody's going to go, that one clearly, like there is probably multiple pages of just written word at the start of that score that really explains, like, here's how I'm going to lay this out for you, friend. And then they just make it work. Yeah, that's a cool one. All right, I think we got one more little one. Yeah, we'll just listen to a little bit of this. So this one I picked as an example of percussion, not in so much of like a solo or front role, but more as a sort of a role player in a larger ensemble. This piece is one that the Vermont Winds did a few years back. I think it was when Chris Rivers was doing the conducting. But really good chance to hear like a bunch of different percussion instruments as textures in the bigger ensemble, but not out front as much.
Nice. Also, note the garbage can that at one point they're going to be performing on and playing.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Sweet. Okay. So here we are with our sample auxiliary percussion legend, otherwise known as a notation chart. So this is something that you could make to put in the front of the score, in the front of the percussion part, or the percussion score, if your piece is really involved with percussion, that just clears up, hey, here's what's going on. It's important to note this is a sample. This is not like a, like a commandment level rule of notation. This is just one way you could do it. So basically, there's a few different ways that you can help your percussionists know what's going on within how you set it up. You'll notice there are some different note heads. Oftentimes those will be soft dictated, suggested by the kind of instrument. So cymbals, for example, traditionally get an X note head. Drums usually get just a normal circle note head. And then triangle note heads get used sometimes to help differentiate between those two things as well. It's really good to make a note in the score when the part comes up, reminding you what's going on. For example, let's say that all of these instruments showed up in the same part. If I got 50 measures into the piece and then saw the first occurrence of the cowbell, if it wasn't noted as cowbell in that entrance, I might forget. The exception to that rule is if you have a really, really involved part that is, nigh unsight readable, where you're really switching between a lot of these instruments, in which case you're sort of making the assumption that your performer is going to dedicate a substantial amount of time to really learn the notation as well as the intricate part. So there's a bit of a sort of like, how much time do you expect to be taken prepping your piece? So for those of you who are doing, say, like an opus composition, you're probably aware the rehearsal schedule for opus is pretty tight. So you want to be mindful that, something super, super intricate without reminders is likely to get a little bit gummed up in the works. So the more clarity you can offer, the cleaner your performers will be able to play it for you. All right. Let's talk about drum set a little bit. DJ Matt LaRocca, can we do the link there? Yeah.
Real quick, I have a question.
Yeah.
Does it matter where on the staff the note goes, or is it because it's always labeled? Like, does it change?
That's a great question. Yeah. So we just use lines and spaces to differentiate between instruments, just like you would differentiate between pitches for a pitched instrument. There are some more sort of accepted rules for that when we get to drum set, which we'll see in a second. In general, pitch does apply. So you'll notice like the bass drums tend to be down on the bottom of the staff. And then some of the higher pitch instruments like the triangles, crash cymbals tend to be up. One exception to that, which we'll talk about in drum set, is you'll see the first upper left instrument there is pedal hi-hat. And the fact that it's a pedal is very relevant to where it is on the staff. That's a great question. We'll talk a little bit more about that right now when we get into our drum set stuff. All right. So for drum set, things get a little bit more complicated. Drum set is approached a little bit differently than a percussion setup, in that we tend to think of it as one instrument, right? So when your percussionist gets a part that says, okay, you've got slapstick and triangle and maraca and half-filled glass water bottle, they go, okay, I have an assortment of toys and I need to go gather these things, and I've got these toys laid out, and then I'll switch between instruments. Your drum set player doesn't think about it like that, right? Like we don't think, okay, I'm going to switch now from playing the hi-hat to the rack tom. It's all part of the same instrument. So when we're notating for drum set, we try to make it so that it's pretty fluid, and can really be sort of absorbed as one line, you know, just like say a piano player would read their part. So this notation key is a little bit more standardized. This is how we'd expect to see it. So kick drum either in the bottom space or sometimes on the bottom line. Snare drum in what would be treble clef C. X is your rim click. Toms can kind of be skewing about the staff. We'll assume that that's what you mean if it's not on the snare line and it's a full note head. And then we've got our hi-hats with the little O above it for open, and then some different variations on rides and crashes. And then hi-hat with the foot, again, down low, which we'll talk about a little bit down below here. DJ Matt LaRocca, let's scroll down a little bit. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. So stems in percussion writing. We'll talk both battery and drum set right now. So in battery percussion, and that's you know, when we're talking like somebody's playing the bass drum, someone else is playing the snare drum. You would expect the stem direction to indicate player. So in sort of like a classic marching band piece, say, we would expect to see the bass drum written with stems down to indicate that the bass drum player is going to play that, and then the snare drum with stems up to indicate the snare drum player is going to play that. With drum set, it's all one person. There is actually a rule for stems, and it is this. If you are playing something with your feet, that's like bass drum pedal, hi-hat, rarely a cowbell on a machine, the stems want to go down. Anything else that you're playing with your hands, the stems want to go up. So what I wrote in here is an example of how like Sibelius will pop it out if you don't tell it what you want. And as a drum set player, this is a nightmare. This is like, what is happening? Oh no, it takes a long time to decipher. I believe on the next page, we've got the cleaned up version. Oh, look at that. Yeah, that's more like it. So here, the stem down notes are the feet, bass drum, we can see clearly what's going on. And then we've got the cymbals and the snare up top. Well, it's not the exact same rhythm, but the idea is there. Okay. Drum set's also interesting because it is first and foremost an improvisatory instrument. So its development came out of, playing for shows, for vaudeville, early jazz, early blues. So the style is one that's a little bit less specifically notated. Now, nowadays we see it notated more, but it is totally fine to expect that your drum set player will be able to kind of fill in a few of the blanks. So really quickly, my tips on that are to keep it simple. Just kind of explain like, hey, here's like the basic idea, and then I'm going to trust you, drummer, to help me kind of make some choices on that. Some great ways to do that are slashes. So you give sort of the basic beat and then put in some slashes that basically tells your drummer, keep going. And feel free to make some slight ad-lib choices if you want. Let's see, what do we got going on down from there, Matt? Oh yeah, good. Yeah, if you're using slashes, you want to put in how many measures have been played in the phrase. So you'll see there are those little 8s in parentheses. That's really helpful for if you're looking at a page full of slashes and going, oh my God, how long have I played that? So little phrase indicators help. Double bars also, you'll see, help with that. There's hits. This is classic for like big band writing or musical like pit band writing. So with this, you're saying, hey, the groove is happening, and elsewhere in the band or in the ensemble, there are some rhythms that you might want to know about. If it's above the staff, that says, hey, this is an FYI. You can kind of interact with this as you choose. If they're down on the staff, like the second example here, where it says with horns, when I see that as a drummer, that really says, hey, I want you to hit these hits. I want you to play this rhythm. So that's sort of a level up on the priority scale if it's down on the staff. All right. Oh, yeah. Okay, now you might think I'm joking with this one. Here's the thing. A lot of times, especially our younger composers, and I count myself as a young man in this category, really love writing for the computer. We get some notation together that when we hit play on what my parents lovingly called the monkey band when I would be toying around with it in my bedroom as a kid, the monkey band will play back this amazingly complicated rhythm like it's nobody's business, and it sounds sweet. And then the composer says, all right, that's great. Let's send that to the printing press. We are done. And then that shows up on a human being's music stand. And it is a sad and confusing day for everyone. So what I really, really encourage composers to do, especially if they're folks who are feeling a little bit nervous about like how a drummer would interpret something like that, is just use a few words in English. Big fill. That's really what we meant to say in measure 2 up in the Australian surf metal piece there. We wanted a big, exciting fill. So your drum set player is probably going to be able to figure out something that's going to work for that piece and for their style better than a lot of really heady notation would do, especially if you are crunched on rehearsal time. That can be a big time saver right there. All right, awesome. Getting to the end of this one. This stuff, a lot of it, by the way, ties over beyond drum set. So this one, for example, is good across the board. If you are writing for a percussion instrument that does not sustain, you can simplify your rhythms. So, for example, we've got this rhythm here on the bottom of page 4, and that's how we would expect to see it for, say, trumpet, right? We really want to specify that the notes on beat 1, 2, and 4 are short. And we want to specify that there's a slur between the 2 notes on beat 3. If I was playing that on a snare drum, though, it's going to sound exactly the same if I notate it, rhythm-wise. The accents would actually matter. But, sustain-wise, it would be exactly the same if I notate 8th note, 8th rest, 8th note, 8th rest, versus just putting quarter notes there. And reading wise, those quarter notes, a lot easier to read. It's less things on the page. So if you have a chance to consolidate those things, go ahead and do it, even if it doesn't necessarily line up with a corresponding rhythm on the score. Your percussionist will be able to sight read or near sight read that a lot easier. Yeah, okay. These last ones kind of come back to what I was saying at the beginning. The real key to learning how to write for drums is to just know something about the drums. So talking to the people who play the instrument, boy, that's just good across the board, percussion and beyond. You know, here we are, right? Talking to a drummer can help out. Man, if I was going to write for harp, I would be on the phone to Victoria and I'd be like, help. Some pedals, something 10 years ago, composition class, maybe, right? But I would get her on the horn and I would really be like, okay, let's talk some shop. So if you're in a bind, yeah, talk to the person who's going to be playing it or somebody, you know, who plays that kind of stuff. And then listening. Oh man, just get some listening down. And when you talk to your drummers, they're going to tell you some of the things that every drummer knows, right? So these examples I put down, like, okay, it's a Purdy shuffle thing. Take a Buddy Rich solo. Give me a Bonham groove. Do a Sheila E fill. All of these sort of emblematic players. That really says volumes. And if you know that, like we know, you can just say that and save yourself hours and hours and hours of like painstaking notation. If you just say like, you've heard Art Blakey, we'll go, okay, yeah. So that's a really good one. That one's especially for drum set, for the more improv driven of the instruments. But boy, just in this day and age, right, we have access to everything, anytime, anywhere. So giving a sonic reference is such a powerful tool as a composer that I encourage people to take advantage of that. Yeah, I gave one little website that's a bit niche, that just is this super dorky and awesome housing of like every drummer. And they just, it's cute. It's just a lot of drumming stuff. So you can just kind of tootle through this and get lost down the rabbit hole of stuff drummers like to listen to and talk about. And I always learn something new when there's a House of the Dragon up there too. Nice. So you always get something cool from a old drummer world there. All right. I think that's that piece of the puzzle.
But before we move away from notation, just to give the sort of the counterpart to the drum set, which what we were talking about earlier, and this is my, backing up what you say, like study and listen and look at what other people have done. And so this is, if we're using percussion as sort of like in that last piece that we listened to, where it's augmenting different things, this is the most common arrangement of West Side Story that there is in the orchestra rep. And usually 3 to 4 percussionists play this, and we'll see that every single thing has these different notations, these different written out instruments that tell people where to be and what to do. So we have a couple of cymbal crashes and timpani notes. We have the castanet come in on our upper line and keep a groove going. We have bass drum, stems going down, even though it's probably going to be a concert bass drum. Stems up, we have our snare drum. It helps us see 2 different instruments in the same line being represented. And every time that they shift in instruments, there's a notation. Here, the castanets are taken over there. We have timpani, vibraphone, cymbal crash, and it lays it all out back to the claves, lays it all out so that it's clear and there's sort of not a lot of questions about what is happening where and when. And this is a place where there is a lot of different battery instruments that are being used, and it does it really nicely.
Yeah, very clean score. That's what we hope to see when we get there on the first rehearsal, right? We can just read it down, go, got it. All right, awesome. Okay, I think that covers most of what I had kind of in the can, ready to go. We did get a nice question from someone who I don't think's here at the moment, but it's a great question. So I wanted to read it and talk about it a little bit. So the question reads, it would be interesting to learn which types of drums and other percussion instruments are used in specific music genres or specific beats that are used within genres. How can you use beats to give emotion to songs? Like certain chord progressions give different feelings depending on how they're used. A lot of cool stuff to unpack in there. So the first part of that question, like what types of drums and percussion instruments are used in specific genres or what specific beats are used there? It's another one of those. I would go to the source. So like if you're writing for a specific style or have a specific style in mind, try and check out some of that music. Either recording or if you have access to a score, even better if you can listen and look at the same time. You can check out what's going on there. There are so many genres that it's impossible to answer that question comprehensively, but that is certainly the approach that I would take to tackling that. The second part of the question: how can you use beats to give emotion to songs? Sort of like chord progressions. I was really tickled by that one. I like that thought. So we're sort of thinking isomorphically here about, I think of like a nice tug at your heartstrings chord, right? Could you accomplish that same feeling with a choice that you make in the percussion section? Or like, a really dissonant chord, like a nice, big, fully diminished damsel in distress on the train track chord. Is that something that you can accomplish with a percussion texture or a groove? I'm going to open up the floor on this one. What do we think? Does anyone have any thoughts on how percussion can be used to evoke emotion in a similar way to how we use harmony?
I feel like you definitely can. I mean, because this is a project that I'm kind of ongoing. It's just a percussion part, but more inspired of like growing up in poverty with like limited bare percussion, but we all just wanted to play, and kind of being creative and ingenuitive with like, what do we have? Like we have a gate, we have like buckets, we got trash cans too. And it's one of those where like just certain rhythmic choices, dynamic choices you can do, or just playing around with sound and just kind of thinking outside the box of like, okay, like I have a snare, what can I do with the snare? Or one of the instruments that I like my neighbor played was a berimbau and bowdron drums. So I'm like, okay, this is really cool. How the heck do you play it? Because I don't know it. But then like the 7-year-old in me was just like, I want to play it. Like, give me that. But it's one of those where like, okay, texture's a thing. Or even I use a lot of percussive extended technique on harp, and even would take guitar techniques too. So it's one of those like, okay, well, like if I could play this on this instrument or listening, like how can I get that texture? How can I get that sound? Like, okay, to me this sounds like sadness, or oh, this sounds pretty mellow. Like, can it enhance it? Or maybe changing the tempo of things can enhance it.
Yeah, I dig that. Yeah. Abby, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not a percussion player, so I can't really say a lot, but like maybe I agree with the tempo stuff. I would probably go more in the rhythmic direction, because you still want it to fit what you're doing with the like winds or brass or whatever else is happening in the piece. So probably just focusing on rhythm and making sure that it fits the vibe you want. If you're going for like something angry, like obviously I would do like short staccato, like just like big things like that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, and even add on to that, like take advantage of the silence too. Because I feel like even as musicians, we completely forget that like silence and the rest are just as powerful as like striking an instrument or a fanfare.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. Yeah, I love where your heads are at on that. I was thinking some about this and pushing myself to think about like groove or even percussion timbre and trying to think of some specific examples of how this works. And I actually did think of a couple. The low hanging fruit for me that I thought of was a lot of horror movie soundtracks really make great use of percussion textures. Like, oh man, this is where I wish I was in the band room. But you know the cymbal harmonic sound, the like spooky, like maybe there's a murderer in here. So there's this really cool sound where you take a drumstick and you kind of push it, the tip of the drumstick across the cymbal, and it goes. It makes this really great, like kind of ethereal, sparkly, creepy sound. The other one that came to my mind is just like a really, really great 808 sound. Like just a classic like drum machine, kick drum. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been, like packing up at the end of a gig or, like hanging out at the canned music set at a wedding, and just a song starts with some little intro and then just the downbeat of the main groove starts with just a slamming, awesome sounding kick drum. And that moment makes the crowd go, oh, and they all start dancing around, right? Like they don't even need to hear what happens after that. It's just, that's the cue. Hey, party time, 808 bass, boom. So there are some cool things that that percussion does that really can actually like very directly get at emotion, right? Like these things that some of it's like cultural, like nostalgic kind of stuff. And some of it is just the instrument just does the thing, like that screechy cymbal sound. It just sounds creepy, right? Like you hear it and you're like, okay, I'm creeped out. This is scary now. So I appreciated that question. I was glad to get to answer that. All right, we've got a couple minutes left. Folks who are present, Abby, Victoria, do you have any questions or thoughts as we're bringing things to a close?
I have a question. So, what would be your biggest takeaway from this? Like mine was kind of like, don't mix up the stems, because I figure that's really important for percussion. But like, what would you say is the biggest thing we should take away from this?
Great question to ask a teacher. Good job. I would hope the two biggest things were the first things that I led with. That if you want to do anything with music, the first step is listening to the music, writing it, playing it, any of that. Got to hear it. And to not be afraid to give something a try, even if you are not feeling like you are an expert. And that one, I'll add a little something onto that. I think that there is a history, especially the higher up in education you get, that there's sort of this like in club sort of feeling that can start to happen, where like there's people who know and there's people who don't know about music stuff, and usually you will feel like the person who doesn't know, right? And you're just like, oh man, well I'm not so and so, they like know. And the secret is nobody knows. It's all just a bunch of sound. And we just kind of decide like, this is how I'm going to make my sound today. And there are some people who kind of choose to do it in the same way, but there's no right or wrong. There's no like correct and incorrect. At the end of the day, if it's good sound and it expresses something and somebody feels something from it, you did it right. So my big thing is like, hey, if you can figure out a way to be clear and to have a positive experience happen with music, you did it. Go for it.
Thank you.
You got it.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions. So back to the slashes thing, you said to indicate like how many measures of it, since is it just the initial written rhythms that was, or is it just when it started?
That's a good question. So the way that I like to do it is I like to just kind of note at the end of a phrase, this phrase has been this many measures long. So say that I, notate the groove for 2 bars and then have 6 bars of slashes. At the end of that 8 measure phrase, I will put 8 in parentheses. That's one that's interesting because that's not always the way it shows up. Sometimes it's, hey, you have been given 6 measures of slashes. In Drummerland, we tend to like to know phrases. We want the raw info on like how long is the phrase of the song. And you'll see that notation up above the staff is a little bit different than like a hard repeat in the staff, right? So I wouldn't do 8 down in the staff because that would effectively add 2 more measures to it. But yeah, I like to just know how many measures was that phrase I just played. And that helps me just kind of keep track of where I'm at. And most folks, if there's any confusion, if you're using double bars, like double bar lines at the end of phrases too, and this is a little bit more in drum set land, that'll probably clear up any ambiguity, right? Like if we look and go, wait a minute, but there are 6 measures of slashes, but it says 8. Oh, okay, yeah, it's an 8 measure phrase.
Okay. All right. And then also too, for writing for drum set too, like, is it better to, oh, actually not better. Like, how would you, like, if you're writing for something and you want the, sorry, I can't think how to phrase this one. So how do you feel like it, if you're writing for drum set, especially since it's kind of a different world than other percussion, what would be kind of too much, or like, hey, you're kind of pushing this where like it won't be played, or like, especially in the compositional world, like if you want your stuff played, you might not have enough time for rehearsal. Like, how much would be kind of too much, especially for like, because I see it as like you're using your entire body, because I know for harp I have to use my entire body, and sometimes like I could do complexity stuff, like complex stuff, but I need more time. But it's one of those like, I can't do it in 2 days. Like, you gotta simplify it. Like, what would be like too much, or is there any ways to see like, okay, like this might be a lot to do for your hands and your feet at the same time, or like how do you find that balance?
It's a great question. So I think you hit on a lot of the answers in the question. So yeah. One of the pieces is like, what is my expectation for how this piece is going to be rehearsed? So if it's like, I need a piece that can be sight read on the bandstand, I want that puppy to be as streamlined and like bare bones as it can be. Like, give me just the meat and potatoes. If there's a really important hit, put it in there. When you need me to stop playing, put rest. And that's probably it. If it's one where it's like, hey, this is part of a concert band piece and I want drum set on it and it's going to get rehearsed an hour a week for a semester at a college, that could probably be a little bit more involved, right? In that scenario, you're kind of expecting that players are going to have some time to like take it home and unpack it and study it and digest it a little more. That's honestly the biggest driver for me when I'm on the writing side that I use to try and figure that out. A lot of it also depends on your player, right? So like if I'm writing for middle school band, I will write less things more explicitly than if I was writing for like a professional drummer. So like middle school band, I'm more likely to write out the rhythm over and over, or like anytime there's a little change, be like, hey, you could do exactly this. And just keep it like really straight down. Whereas for, like a fellow pro player, I can be like, you know what I'm talking about, and kind of sketch it a little bit more, and feel free to take some liberties with spicing it up a little bit.
Yeah. And then also this kind of leads towards like my last question. But like I know like a big thing is just like, hey, call up any percussionist you know to ask them questions and stuff like that. Like I know I have like a couple questions I always ask any musician, kind of common ones too. But what are kind of things that like from a performer's perspective, like please ask me this, or like I see like these are things that are commonly like taking up our time in rehearsals that we don't need to be, but like needs to be more focused. But also like, okay, I really enjoy playing this, but I don't see it that often, like something like that. Because I know like the biggest question I always ask all my performers is just like, other than extended technique, like what do you enjoy playing the most, or like it's not highlighted as much, but like you want to bring it out more.
That's such a cool composer question. I really love that.
Yeah.
Well, I can say for me personally, I enjoy material that is really focused on the experience of the ensemble and the experience of the audience, and less focused on like, look at what I can do, you know. But that is totally my, you know, my personal style. I think there are lots of folks out there who really enjoy like something that is gruelingly technical and like is like you hear it and you go, man, you have practiced this for a very long time. That's their thing. Yeah, boy, I'm struggling on that one. I don't know in a nutshell what I would say like I like to do. I like music that leads to positive experiences for the musicians in the audience. That's kind of bottom line for me. I do like the, you know, thinking about, especially, you know, I think most of the time that we write, we're writing for someone. Like, you know, sometimes we're in a situation where we're like, okay, I'm writing this thing and it's just out in the world and like a bunch of different people are going to play it. But like realistically, most of the time you're writing for a person. And either, you know, like the demographic that person's fitting in, like, okay, you're going to be an 8th grade percussionist, or okay, you are my fellow student at Vermont College of Fine Arts, or you are someone who got, you know, flown in from the West Coast to play for Vermont College of Fine Arts. And when that happens, you really, yeah, you can write for that person. And kind of ask those questions that you're asking.
Yeah, because I know like something that I didn't even consider for a while was like asking like even like my percussion friends like, oh, what's your like what sticks do you have available, like what's kind of in your pack? And I'm like, because one day I had a friend, he pulled out like a bow. I'm like, oh, I didn't know you had that. I'm like, yeah, I always have that. And I'm like, oh, I'm like, you know, this is good to ask, but like, I know like I need to start asking like, okay, what types of mallets do you have? What types of sticks do you have? Or like, I know I'm writing for a percussionist now, and it's one of those like, oh, I like to do this. Like, I'm grabbing this and this. These are, or like, oh, I have a couple of like stuff like from different cultures in my bag. I'm like, oh, this is good to know. But like I would never think of asking what types of mallets they have. But like what's a good, like I would say even like a good basis of questions you should ask percussionist, in case like if you were to ask them or need help besides like, okay, like what's the sound you can produce, how's this and this.
The question of what's available is a very percussion-y question, right? It's one of the few things where it's like, well, what do you happen to have with you today? Like, you know, there's not a day where you just don't bring half of your harp strings with you.
Yeah.
Right. But in Drummerland, like, you know, if I'm rolling out for a gig, I do need to know what I'm showing up for. Like, do I need my timpani mallet kit? Am I supposed to bring like my, you know, jazz stick bag with like all my brushes and stuff? So I think that one, it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of like, asking what instrumentation and percussion equipment you have available to write. So, for our music comp students, it's like the list that DJ Matt LaRocca put here in the chat. And then it's also being very clear in your writing, especially if you're not going to have that conversation before the parts go out, to say, hey, you will need the following things. So that way, if your percussionist gets the part, they can look at it and go, oh, okay, here's my laundry list for the day. I got to bring these things in. And there really isn't a like industry standard, like we always have this. There's just too much stuff these days, right? Like I don't have a bow, but if you needed me to get a bow, I could probably talk to somebody about getting a bow. And I have a kazoo with me in my stick bag, but that's not like standard ops. Like everybody's got their kazoo with them. So yeah, checking in's a good idea in general. All right. That was fun.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That was really fun. It's great. So we'll chop this up. We'll serve it up to the music comp students writing for Opus. Abby and Victoria, thank you for coming on by. We appreciate it, and Andy, a huge thank you to you and for your expertise and your time.
My genuine pleasure. Happy to help out Music Comp. You guys are doing awesome work.